Thank you very much. I would have begun with number 4, but okay. Good evening. Thank you, Rabbi Rosenfeld, all the distinguished rabbis, and all distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be here, to honor my mentor, our mentor, spiritual mentor, the Rebbe. But I think it's always good to begin with perhaps a skeptical question, if I may. And that is, it's 29 years since the Rebbe's passing from this physical world. Why are we still remembering this man, gathering together? And frankly, what is the secret that Chabad and Lubavitch continues to grow and thrive despite the fact that the Rebbe is not here? As one journalist asked me last year, I remember the same time of the year, that was the 28th anniversary, he said, no company on earth can function, let alone grow, without a CEO. So how is Chabad doing it? I should add that many companies can't succeed even with a CEO. So that's a critical question to ask, because it's true that everybody here perhaps sees it as a given, the Rebbe's greatness, his continuing effect and impact on us, on the world. But most of the world doesn't yet know that secret. So I've been trained by the Rebbe himself, and we don't take anything for granted. There's no such thing as preaching to the converted. Not that you're converted necessarily, but we have to be able to understand that language that we can explain to ourselves and to others. You know, since Russia's in the news, so I don't know if this is a politically correct or incorrect joke, you'll decide. We'll see, right? So before Putin, and before previous prime ministers, after Stalin, Joseph Stalin died or was murdered in 1953. So the new prime minister of this former Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev. Okay, one day in Moscow, there's a guy running around the streets yelling that Khrushchev is crazy. Now, in the United States, perhaps you can get away with that, but not there. He was immediately arrested, and there's no due process, prosecuted, and sentenced to death. Actually, to 2 death sentences. 2 bullets to his head, and then they would send a bill to the family. Why 2 death sentences? The first was for insulting a head of state, and the second was for revealing a state secret. How's that? Okay? You can use it in other contexts as well, you know? So, I'd like to reveal a state secret tonight, and I think I can get away with it without being sentenced for anything. And that is the secret of the Rebbe, the secret of Chabad, the secret perhaps of Judaism in general, because you could ask really the same question. The mayor made reference to it. You know, the Jewish people are here now for close to 4,000 people, 4,000 years on earth. A small fledgling nation. We still are a real minority. And despite all odds and despite all the executions and genocides and holocausts and persecutions and expulsions, we're still here. In Pittsburgh, cities all over the world. And everybody wants to know the secret. I remember meeting the Dalai Lama, who was in exile from Tibet, and he asked me that question. Interestingly, any Jew that meets him, he says, why are you coming to me? Everything we know came from you. And he asked the question, how did you guys make it without a country, without a nation? I mean, until recently, the Jews were basically exiled everywhere. And persecuted, as I said, and expelled and killed, pillaged from one country to the next. So really, This question is much larger than just regarding Chabad Lubavitch, but it's the same answer. And hopefully I'll try to do justice and try to explain in language that we can all appreciate. And most importantly, the biggest question, of course, is how we can implement it in our own lives. And let's be honest, the greatest thing you can do in life is to leave a perpetual impact. I remember speaking at a corporate conference, and they asked me this question. They said, same question with the CEO. What is the secret? Everybody wants to know. How can you make an imprint that will last not just 29 years, but many years, forever and ever? So there's so much that lies in this topic, and of course comes down to its relevance to us in our personal lives. So one of the things I can share with you in my own journeys in life, I grew up in Crown Heights, USA. You've heard of this place, right? Yeah. It's like a shtetl, like Squirrel Hill, a little different. And my parents were both Russian-born. They came to the United States after World War II. And I grew up in the Chabad system, went through the yeshiva system, the education system. But I personally was blessed or cursed, if you wish, with a certain, skeptical side to me. So though I grew up in a very intense environment and a very intense education, but at the same time, thank God I was blessed to be in a home that was not dogmatic. My father was a journalist. I say was because he passed away 18 years ago, and I don't know if there are journalists in heaven, so I say what? I don't know if they need that up there. So I grew up in a home, an open-minded home. So though it was very intense and very much, I remember going to school from morning to night, but at the same time I was allowed to explore. And I know it was a blessing because I know many of my colleagues and friends and classmates and others did not necessarily have it that way. But it served me well because it allowed me to appreciate Judaism, and especially Chabad and Hasidus, without it being imposed on me. So after the years that I worked, as was mentioned by Rabbi Oldtime, for many years remembering and then recreating and publishing the Rebbe's talks, I wrote Toward a Meaningful Life. And that was a book that was meant to be a bridge. I know the word bridge has been used. Pittsburgh has 446 bridges. It's called the City of Bridges. So a lot of what we're talking about is about bridges. And in many ways, my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, was meant to be a bridge between Torah, between Judaism, its universal teachings, and a secular modern world, which seem to be very two antithetical worlds that don't really come together. And the only way that you can communicate teachings that come from Judaism and Torah to a modern scientific world requires an approach that doesn't take anything for granted, and you have to find a deeper resonating message that will resonate with people that may not walk into a synagogue or into a JCC or a Chabad house or any Jewish environment. And that's what happened. After my book was published, William Morrow, the publisher, sent me on a book tour across the United States. First started with 20 cities. One of them was Pittsburgh, actually. I was here in Barnes & Noble in Squirrel Hill. I've heard it moved since. And then it turned into 90 cities because it was a very successful tour. Now in Barnes & Noble, you meet people of all walks of life. Many are not necessarily coming to hear me speak. They're coming to buy an auto repair manual or to get a coffee. So it's from fascinating interactions with non-captive audiences. I would even say sometimes hostile audiences. If we had a lot of time tonight, I could regale you with hundreds of stories of humorous, ridiculous, even offensive stories about my interactions. Here, a guy with a beard and a yarmulke speaking at a Barnes & Noble in places like Alaska, or so on. But I'll share one story which captures perhaps many similar stories that happened. This was in Cleveland, not far from here. So in those days, I don't know how it is today, this was pre-internet. We're talking about 1995. Websites were just beginning to emerge. I remember I had an email address. I didn't know what it was, but I had one because they told me to put an email address in there. And so the publisher would set up interviews for new authors, basically where they were called print, radio, and TV interviews. And that's what I would do during the day. And then in the evening, there would be a book signing at a bookstore. So in Cleveland, basically called the TV morning show, the morning drive show, where they feature new authors. You have like a 6 or 7 minute interview on a couch, live, about your book. And here it is. I come into the studio, scheduled time, 7 a.m., something like that. And the producer introduces me to the person who's going to interview me, the anchor person. And as soon as she gives one look at me, I see her whole face changes, the demeanor. Like, she became seriously disturbed. I had no idea why. I hadn't eaten breakfast, so I had nothing smeared on my face. I don't know what it was. Anyway, so I said, is everything all right? She says, yes. So I say, why you seem to be so disturbed? Did I do anything that offends you? She said, no, I'm shocked. I love your book, Toward a Meaningful Life. It's on my nightstand. I read it every evening. It's one of my favorite books. It's inspiring, empowering. And I never expected that the author of this book would look like you. I didn't take it as a compliment, but so I said to her, what do you expect me to look like? I have to apologize to the rabbis because if I say it exactly as she said it, maybe some language is a little colorful. Is that all right, Rabbi? We'll know if I'm invited again after this. Okay. I could change a few words. I just want to make sure. No censorship? Okay. Fine. So she says to me what I expected. I expected to see a guy, clean-shaven, 6'2", handsome, sexy dude. That's what I was expecting. A cool guy, basically. So I said to her, well, I thought I was most of that, maybe. 2 out of the 3, 1 out of the 3. So I said to her, hey, we got our topic. Why don't you ask this to me on the show? I said, I don't want to offend you. I said, no, you find ways to say it. And that's what happened. We sat down on the couch, and she started the interview. I have a new author here. Great book, Toward a Meaningful Life. I love this book. Recommend it to anyone. People of all backgrounds, Jew, non-Jew, religious, non-religious, even for atheists. That's the way she put it. And Rabbi Jacobson, I'd like to ask you, my question would be this. Since it's such a relevant book, and it resonates for people like myself, or people that I think would read it, wouldn't it be better received if you looked like one of us? That's the way she put it. So that's a little more diplomatic. If you look like one of us. So I took advantage of the moment, fine, So I said, I don't know if you would have gotten away with that if I was a Saudi Arabian prince with my garments. They would have fired you for saying something like that. Since I'm a Jew, I guess you can get away with it. I said it with a smile. It wasn't, and she took it in the right spirit. And then I said, on the contrary, I'm very comfortable in my own skin. This is how I'm comfortable the way I dress, the way I look. I would never ask you to change your garments or the way you dress. Why can't we learn to get beyond the surface of things and talk soul to soul about who we are and what we stand for instead of stereotyping each other? Isn't that what my book means anything? It comes to teach that message. That's what the Rebbe came to teach. As the Rebbe once said, that labels are for clothing, not for souls. And this turned into a very interesting conversation. The biggest cliche of all is a book, don't judge a book by its cover. Everybody judges a book by its cover. That's why it's a $1 billion industry. It's called packaging. Everyone judges books by its cover, unfortunately. And anyway, this turned into a very meaningful conversation, which was exactly that. This was one example of many, what I have had to deal with, the stereotypes. And I can tell you as a speaker and as a writer, and if you ever communicate, the most difficult part is not getting a message across. It's getting rid of the invisible stereotypes that people impose on each other. That's how we do it. It's not malicious. It could be innocuous. It doesn't mean it's coming from any deliberate place. That's what we do. It's convenient to put people on shelves. So I think it's a part of our instinct to organize things. But organizing could also end up becoming racist. And it could also become discriminatory and full of prejudice and bias. So one of the first things I can say that I learned from the Rebbe, that we could all learn, is how to cut through these layers. That's not how we dress, and it's not even what we say. That every one of us has fundamentally a divine soul within us. And if you want the words of the founding fathers to make it less Jewish and more universal, that they write, all men are created equal, okay, all people are created equal, and by virtue of the Creator we have unalienable rights. This is a fundamentally Jewish message, but also a universal one. And everybody can agree with that. So when you're able to access that deeper dimension that really transcends our differences, that doesn't mean we can't disagree. We can fundamentally disagree. We can adamantly disagree. But it means there's a fundamental dignity to each one of us. When you begin with that premise, life is very, very different. Not just on a global level, but also on a personal level. Whether it's relationships, marriage, whether it's communities, and of course, whether it's nations, countries, and so on. There'd be no war, there'd be no hatred, there'd be no injustice if we understood this fundamental principle. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is go a little deeper in discussing some of the universal and powerful teachings that the Rebbe contributed. And here's another skeptical question that I always ask my Chabad colleagues. Because again, we don't want to take anything for granted. What would the world be like if the Rebbe did not exist? You want to add God forbid, Chaz v'shalom. What would the world be like? And just to drive the point home, everybody knows, if you ask, what were Albert Einstein's contributions? Everyone immediately says, E equals MC squared. I said MC squared. Okay, squared. Mendel, you can do something with this, I'm sure. He's a copywriter. Theory of relativity, the theory of special relativity, and so on. So if you were challenged, what is the Rebbe's contribution? What is his formula? And it's not such an easy question to answer when you grow up with something, because you take it as a given. What do you mean? Of course, the Rebbe is the greatest leader in history, the greatest leader in our times. But you have to answer the question in a tangible way. And I'm not talking about someone who's necessarily hostile. Someone's curious. What's the answer to that question? So now I've set myself up here, of course, because I have to find answers for all of this, right? I can't get away with just leaving tonight and saying, Rabbi Rosenfeld, Rabbi Walter, now it's your problem to find the answer. But the question of a wise person is half an answer. So I will directly address this. So in this challenge of our times, some call it you can say the dichotomy between faith and modernity. Some say reason and belief, religion and science. And many see are at war with each other, or definitely a tenuous relationship between the two. You can say that sums up in so many ways the challenges of our modern world. There was a time where religion really was the dominant force in all of the world. But with the Enlightenment and following the Renaissance and everything that evolved from there, religion and science, or what some people would call, as I said, reason and faith, become like two different worlds, and many see them as actually contradictions. And this is definitely one of the greatest challenges of our time. And if a leader is to be a leader, must address this question. And you'll look around, and you'll see that no one has really found an answer. Many people compartmentalize, or they choose one over the other. You have religious dogma rejecting science, and you have science rejecting religion. In the United States, there's a statistic, very fascinating statistic, that over 90% of Americans believe in some form of spirituality and God, but only 40% affiliate with religion. That's not a small discrepancy. That means religion and spirituality are not seen as synonymous. And for obvious reasons. Religion associates usually with these words. And I'll start with the more pleasant ones. Then we'll move to the unpleasant ones. The pleasant words would be religion, a tradition, rituals, community, faith, prayer, holidays, services, family, values. If you want to move over to the, let's call it the more negative ones, just watch any Woody Allen movie. Things like guilt, neurosis, judgment, condescension, punishment, punitive God, anger. And it's not my words. Check it out. I don't know your own experiences. But many people will exactly associate with that. Spirituality, on the other hand, spirit. Spirit is free-spiritedness, transcendence, soul, music, you're soaring, reaching greater heights. You see the difference. So they tell the joke about two guys get lost in a hot air balloon. And both of them are looking to find their way. They finally see someone down below. They maneuver the balloon, and they yell down to below. They say, "Where are we?" And he yells back. He says, "You're in a hot air balloon." And a gust of wind comes and whisks them away. Back to square one. And one guy says to the other, what was that? He says, "That was certainly a rabbi." He says, "How do you know it was a rabbi?" He says, "Because what he said was true, but irrelevant." You know? Rabbis shouldn't be laughing at this. This is for the lay people like us. Now, everyone laughs at this joke because it resonates. You know, what does it mean? It's true but irrelevant. It means it could be deep truths, but they're not necessarily relevant and resonating in our lives. This is what I have faced a big part of my life as I address issues. So when I wrote Toward a Meaningful Life, or in any time trying to present Judaism, the Rebbe's teachings, I always have this in mind. I never forget it, because most people have exactly that attitude about religion. You know, one of my favorite stories, I use it in Toward a Meaningful Life, was Rav Levi Yitzchak Barditchev, great Hasidic Rebbe, 19th century, who once said to a self-proclaimed atheist, he said this: "The God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either." You hear that? In other words, we have to define terms. Before we say, "I believe in something, I don't accept it or don't accept it," it could very well be that you were brought up or fed a stereotype that has nothing to do with truth. And that's what you reject, or that's what you laugh at. And this is one of the tremendous contributions the Rebbe introduced, was how to look at Judaism from the inside out and cut beyond all these external misconceptions. This isn't a judgment of those that have these stereotypes. It's based on real experiences. But there's hope, because there's a deeper story going on. So maybe a good way to capture is they tell this anecdote where Lucy comes home from school and she's been studying biology, the origin of our species. And she's all confused. You know, where do we come from? So she asks her mother, "Where do we come from?" The mother breaks out in a beaming face, smiling, and warmly shares with her, "Sit down, let me tell you. I always waited to be able to share this with you. We had a grandfather from a small town in Poland, a grandmother from a little shtetl in Czechoslovakia. A few generations back, we had a great-great-grandfather who compiled a very important work on Jewish law, on halacha. And the farther back we go, the better it gets. All the way to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah of the Bible, all the way back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Beautiful. Beautiful yichus, right? Doesn't get better than that. Her father comes home, and Lucy goes to her father, asks the same question. And in stark contrast to her mother, her father sits and says, "Brace yourself." His face becomes very serious. "I always rue this day. And let me tell you," he says, "well, a few million years back, we originated from apes. Before that, from amphibians. Before that, from bacteria. And as far back as we know, from a ball of gas, 14 billion years ago. So Now you can imagine Lucy's really confused now. She really get two very different answers. So she runs back to her mother and says, Ma, Dad told me one thing, you told me this. What's going on? And she smiled again. She said, we both told you the truth. Your father told you about his side of the family. and I told you about my side of the family. So there you have it. The reconciliation between science and creationism and evolution. You heard it here first. It depends which side of the family. Or perhaps put in other terms, it depends what perspective we have. Yes, we all can behave like animals. We all know that. We can be selfish and narcissistic and behave like beasts. People have unfortunately done that. We've all seen that. But we could also behave like angels. And we can be divine and selfless and noble and virtuous. It really comes down to choices. The Rebbe is the seventh in the line, a dynasty that begins with the Alter Rebbe, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who wrote the classic magnum opus, the Tanya. The whole Tanya is built on this battle between two voices within us, the beast within us, and the soul within us, and the divine within us. Selfish, survival-based life, or transcendent-based life, what the Alter Rebbe calls the animal soul or the divine soul. Sometimes known as the Yetzer Tov, the Yetzer Hara, evil inclination, good inclination. They're always living within us. And at battle, at war. Every moment in our lives, we make these choices. So there do are two voices within us. So it shouldn't be a surprise living in a material world that there are two perspectives on everything. Are we animal at heart, or are we a divine agent at heart? Freudian psychology, even though many have already rejected Freud, but he's still the guy to reject, he's still the guy to argue with. Introduced the subconscious, the id, the selfish pleasure principle drive within each of us, which lies at the heart of who you are. And then there's an ego and a superego that superimposed the red lights and green lights that we create to coexist, or else we just kill each other. Well, by contrast, the Rebbe, citing the Alter Rebbe, would say there's another point that Freud missed. Maybe it was due to his mother or whatever his own history was, and that was that deeper than the id is the yid, the pintele yud, the pintele yid, the spark. So it's true, we all have, yes, we definitely have a selfish side to us. I don't think we need much proof. Everyone just has to look into their own heart and soul. But we have another side to us, which is deeper. And if you really dig deeper into the subconscious or the superconscious, the way I like to put it, you'll find a divine spark. Something that is transcendent in nature, that is loving in nature, that is more about giving than taking. Now, this is not just another idea. This is critical in understanding life today. So if you were to say a contribution of the Rebbe, the truth is I could call this contribution of Chassidus in general, all the Rebbes. But as I'm going to discuss, the Rebbe took these ideas and applied it to a post-World War II world. When he assumed leadership in 1950, which I'm going to address now. But here you have right there a contribution that if this was developed, would create a whole new psychology. Because psychologists and therapists and all those that in the world of healing and recovery still struggle. Everybody has, there's a truth in each one of them. But ultimately it comes down to who is the human being. And since nobody's ever seen a soul, nobody can say definitively. From a Torah point of view, we turn to the Creator, God. The Creator of life told us who we are. You were created in the divine image. That's the essential you. Every morning when we say, Moda Ani, thank you for returning my soul to me. And then a few lines later, the soul you've instilled in me, Neshama shenasate bi tahiri, is pure. No matter what happens in life, it always remains pure. Because what happens in your life, any trauma and any pain and any loss and any suffering, is what happened to you. That's not you. It doesn't define you. It happened to you. If you could hold on and find that and access that part of yourself, that's where all healing comes from. So this was developed in the fullest sense of the word, even on a scientific level, into psychology, It's a psychology that would be indispensable, and I would submit to even preempt most of the ailments of this world. And I'm not trying to be oversimplistic and naive. There's no one button that you press that solves problems. But it does come down to how we look at ourselves, our children, and what we value. So let's move the clock forward. I want to move now. The Rebbe assumes leadership in 1950. Something that most people don't even realize. 1950 is 5 years after World War II, after the Holocaust. It wasn't just a shift, it was a dramatic shift. Go through history, and you'll realize that for the Jewish people particularly, but I would say for the entire world, the last several millennia are basically marked by wars, by violence, by dictatorships. Remember, freedom, the concept of freedom is only a few hundred years old. An institutionalized country that perpetuates freedom is the United States. That's almost less than 300 years ago. What was the world like before that? And Jews are always, like the miner's canary, always acutely feel these injustices, and that's what we've suffered. Yes, there have been moments. There was this golden age in Spain during the time of King Solomon, during the First Temple. But these are small, short periods in history. Our history has been one of suffering and impoverishment and persecution. And if it wasn't genocides, it was expulsions or overtaxation and discrimination. I mean, since the birth of Christianity, actually. But even prior to that, you name it. Go from the Egyptians to the Assyrians, to the Babylonians, to the Greeks, to the Persians, to the Romans. And the list goes on. The Inquisitions, prior to that, the Crusades, after that, the pogroms, and of course the Holocaust. Here's a Rebbe that comes into leadership, first time, perhaps in all of history, into a world of freedom. Here we are gathered together. There's no one outside waiting for us to arrest us or to list our names, which was the story. My father grew up in Russia, Soviet Union. He said we lived in fear 24/7. Anyone can come to arrest you any given moment. And we're just talking now last century. If we were born 80 years ago in Europe, where would we be right now? Thank God. We take it so for granted, we don't even really think about it that much. Because we're born in freedom. Me too. All of us. Most of us. But it doesn't take much to ask parents, grandparents, read a little history. So the Rebbe was faced with a very different reality than anyone was faced before him. All his predecessors, they were struggling with, most of their challenges were life and death, literally life and death. His father-in-law, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, was arrested in 1927, almost killed, then was expelled from Russia. Russia then was the Soviet Union, then Russia, then the Soviet Union. They say had over 10 million Jews. No one knows the exact number. Then, of course, came World War I, World War II. That's what he was struggling with. I don't know if you had one day of menucha, of peace. And even if there was, the next day, who knows what would happen. Here the Rebbe comes into a new world. And here you'll see the greatness of a leader. Because you'd think, hey, now time for vacation. We've suffered enough after a Holocaust. Thank God. You know, Israel, the state, was born in 1948. Jews in the United States are living comfortably. Yes, spiritually, assimilation was destroying this country in many ways. But on a physical level, time for, after suffering so much, what most of us would do, time to relax. And instead, the Rebbe began and waged a new war. Literally, I call it a war. But not a war with swords or with weapons and bloodshed. It was a war against the biggest challenge of freedom. And that is what? Apathy. Apathy. Comfort. You all have heard of the thing called a comfort zone? Comfort zone is beautiful because it's comfortable. But it's not very conducive to growth. Apathy. I can't resist the joke. The guy who asked his friend, what's worse, apathy or ignorance? And he said, I don't know and I don't care. That's apathy. The kiss of death. Someone shares with you a life-changing experience, and the other person responds by yawning and falling asleep on you. That's much worse than an argument. At least there's an argument. You have someone alive, someone kicking or screaming or whatever, they're opposing you. Someone just yawns and just doesn't care. That's what happens when you're in a comfortable place. So no one's suggesting, God forbid, to turn the clock back. But frankly, it's a far harder war to fight apathy than to fight a real enemy. Because what happens in times of freedom? The values that we want to have to fight for become dulled, become blurred. During World War II, it was very, very clear once America understood the stakes, everyone understood you're fighting for life and death, for freedom, for our value system. So enemies tend to crystallize your values. But when there's no one out there attacking you, what do you fight for? What do you believe in? Ask most young men and women, what do you fight for? A video game? You know, who you root for in sports? Other things? I'm not even getting into unhealthy stuff. So the blessing could also be a tremendous curse. And the Rebbe realized a new type of war was upon us. Listen to this irony. 500 years ago, our grandparents, wherever they were, whether it was in Eastern Europe or Russia or in the Sparta countries and Arab countries, wherever they were, Northern Africa, were most likely devout, pious Jews. They didn't even have an option. You couldn't assimilate even if you wanted to. You would not be received. Most Jews were forbidden to join the regular trades. Definitely could not go to universities. The Western world was closed to a Jew. The only way a Jew could somewhat change their destiny, God forbid, was unfortunately through baptism. And even that didn't always help. Quote unquote help. So, and that was when we were tremendously suffering. Then look what happens. As soon as the emancipation of the Jews comes, what happens next? As we experience freedom, in direct proportion to that, the devout devotion changed. Now, explain that. Why would that be? It would seem the more free we are, the more we're able to educate our children, no one's persecuting us, no one's forcing us. But the more relaxed things became, the more the Jews became less committed. Okay, that's a double negative. Fine. If you go back to the beginnings of, we'll call it assimilation, and this is not meant to be a judgment, this is not meant to be a critique, this is meant to be an observation. Once the winds of democracy and freedom were blowing through Europe, so the Jews now were the ones that benefited most. So there's a new challenge. What do? The Protestant world, the non-Jewish world is allowing us into their world. So there was a school of thought that actually used this term. Let's take the best of both worlds. What's the best of both worlds? A Jew at home and a non-Jew in the street. That was a natural expression in Germany in those years. The problem is what happens when there's a conflict between the two. That was one school of thought. Basically, what happened was that we will embrace the Western world, the secular world, and we'll try to maintain and hold on to some of our Jewishness. The problem is that once you start compromising, no one knows where to stop. Then there was another school of thought that opened up. We'll call it the ultra-Orthodox. And that is, even though we're being welcomed into this new Western world, but we'll put on our own blinders. We have to create our own ghettos because it's a threat. It's a threat. The threat of assimilation, the threat of losing our identity. And I'll tell you that till this day, these two schools of thought still prevail, and is the root of so much conflict. And interestingly, philosophically, both of these schools of thought are based on one major flaw. That the divine, God, Judaism, Torah, cannot coexist with the secular world. Comes Hasidic teachings. The Baal Shem Tov, who was born approximately during that time of the emancipation. And by extension, the Rebbes that followed all the way to the Rebbe that we're honoring tonight. Our Rebbe. And taught a third approach. That the same God that created Yom Kippur and a synagogue and all Torah and all its pious expectations is also the God that created the secular world. Is also the God that created technology. Not necessarily the machines, but the power of technology. And the challenge that we have is not to create a dichotomy between the two, but what is the most famous prayer in Judaism? Shema. What's the last word in that prayer? Echad. That there's a fundamental and integral unity, and there's divine everywhere, not just in holy places, everywhere. Every fiber of existence is vibrating and pulsating with divine energy. It's fundamental Hasidic teachings that the Rebbe explained in a language that we all can relate to. And as such, our challenge is how to find and discover and free that spark, to use the Kabbalistic language of it, that divine spark, that divine opportunity that lies, yes, even in social media, just using modern examples, in every piece of food, in every encounter, not just in holy activities. In other words, the third approach is that we have to spiritualize the material world, not to deny it and not to surrender to it, to spiritualize it. Engage, but remain above. That was a radically new approach where the Jews did not have to necessarily rely on that formula up till that point for the simple reason they didn't have that challenge. There was a time in history where you picked up a certain, I guess you could say, innocence from the smell of the chicken soup in your grandmother's kitchen. But today there are many more smells out there, and there are many more competitions. Things competing for our attention and stimulating our senses all the time. And with modern technology, it's only accelerated. So essentially, if you can sum up what is the real contribution or the innovation, if you wish, of Chabad Hasidus, and especially, as I said, as the Rebbe translates it for the 20th and 21st century, is that everything has divine potential, waiting for us to come and release it. And that is the ultimate response to any challenge out there. That doesn't mean, obviously, there are things that are so-called off-limits, destructive, and forbidden. But the very world itself, the material world, is what God put in this world. We didn't create this universe. You know, that scientist turns to God, that says to God, listen, we don't need you anymore. We figured out whatever you can do, we can do now. So God said, show me. So the scientist goes into his laboratory with a big barrel, a big bag of earth, puts it on the table and says to God, I will show you that with this earth, I can create something that will be sprout, some vegetation that will sprout from the earth. So God says to the scientist, why don't you use your own earth? So the point is that we can delude ourselves into thinking that there isn't divine everywhere, but it's all there. Right now, every one of you, in the last minute, exhaled and inhaled between 12 and 18 times. I didn't count, I just know that from before. You don't even notice it. Thank God. Go to a hospital, God forbid, where someone's struggling to breathe, and you'll see what the miracle of breath. You know how many mechanisms have to be in place to breathe in a healthy way? And it's actually a medrash that the Rebbe quotes often. The last verse in the book of Psalms says, every soul praises God. The word for soul, neshama in Hebrew, is also neshima, breath. Every breath you take, praise God, because every breath is a miracle. So before the police sang every breath you take and every step you make and so on, they basically plagiarized. We're not suing them. The greatest flattery. So the point is that the divine is just a matter of language, of how you understand it. Absolutely a given that religion was hijacked by many and distorted, and that's why there are all these negative stereotypes. But look into the Rebbe's talks and discourses, and you'll see a very different take on it. So much of what is rejected by the secular world and religion, especially Judaism, is, like I said earlier, the God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. It's a false Judaism, with all respect. And what we need is to reclaim the Judaism that was taught by Abraham and by Moses and by the great men and women throughout history, that was a deeply spiritual, not like spiritual being divorced from religion, but actually integrated as one. So, when you think of that alone, if I stop right here, to me that is enough to demonstrate that E equals mc squared, that Einstein said, that energy is matter and they're reversible, is actually a concept in Judaism. That everything in this material world is really divine energy. And it's our job is to free it, to redeem it, through our actions and through our behavior. Now, to drive the point home, I will maybe make things a little easier. I'll use an acronym. I'm going to talk about briefly five principles that the Rebbe taught. I'm summing it up. These are thousands of pages and pages that are absolutely critical for life. And when you can embrace these five principles, it's life-changing. I've been looking for a more sophisticated acronym, but I came up with one that's a little corny. So pardon. It's called, the acronym is MIPOD. MIPOD. Okay? And that stands for Mission, Initiative, Persistence, Opportunities, and Destination. And I'll explain. You ever hear of a guy called Chaim Gedalia Rickover? Anybody? He's a fellow Jew. He's known as Admiral Hyman Rickover. He came here to the United States in the early 20th century, and because of pogroms, when the first Jewish immigration, and he ended up rising to in the ranks and became a 4-star admiral in the American Navy. 4 stars the highest you can reach in the Navy. The rest of the military is 5 stars, but 4 stars the highest. He was known as the father of the nuclear navy. Brilliant man. In 1957, just a few years after the Rebbe became Rebbe, he gave a historic talk in Washington, which when I read it, I was like, it struck me. In the talk he said, comparing the production of energy from 1857 to 1957, he said, in 1857, 90% of energy in the world was generated through human labor and animals. In 1957, 90% of energy is generated through machines and fossil fuels. And 2 tremendous implications as a result of that. One, the astronomical skyrocketing of wealth, because even if you controlled all the farmers in 1857, yes, you could have been wealthy, but now you press the right button and you control the machines. And the fossil fuels, wealth exploded in a completely new level. And secondly, which is what I want to focus on, the birth of free time. Basically, during the agricultural revolution, before the industrial revolution, what did most people do during the day? They spent their time toiling in a hot field to be able to produce a bushel of wheat or grain or potatoes or corn to have what to eat, and then they would trade the rest of it. Now suddenly you don't have to go to these farms. All you have to do is purchase it. Take 1957, go to 2023, and it just changes everything. So what happened with all the free time that we suddenly have? So you would think the best scenario would have been that human beings would now use that free time for higher states of transcendence, connecting to deeper dimensions, to become deeper thinkers, become more kinder, nobler. No. Instead, what was born was the birth of leisure. Heard of this thing called leisure? It's called free time. And what do you do in this free time? Most people don't want to even know how much time they waste. We do nothing. There's that joke with this guy, Yankel, is sitting, an old Jew sitting on a bench, and he's all depressed, and his friend comes over and says to him, "Why are you so depressed?" He says, "My wife is very angry at me." "And what's new?" "She's always angry at you." "No, today's something special." "What happened?" "When she was going to work this morning, she asked me, what am I going to do today?" And I said, "Nothing." And she said, "You said that yesterday." And I told her I wasn't finished. He wasn't finished doing nothing. Some people call it a couch potato. Some people call it living vicariously through characters in soap operas or in sports or in Hollywood. So I'm not going to be here some social satire, but the point is a lot of free time. And that's what struck me. That's the world the Rebbe entered, a world of free time, which is a blessing because we're not running from enemies. Great. But what are you doing with the free time? So the Rebbe introduced, and I go now to the my pod. The first thing is that your life has to be a mission-driven life. No company can function without a mission statement. So when you ask personally, someone asks you, what's your personal mission statement in life? I've asked this to thousands of people. So either people giggle and say then, oh, my mission is to be happy, to make a lot of money, or to bring up a good family, a Jewish family. Those are beautiful things, but they don't qualify as missions. A mission, imagine a company saying, our mission is to make money. Our mission is to have happy employees. That's a given. A mission has to be unique, whether you like Google or not, but Google's mission is to organize all the information of the world and make it readily accessible. It's exclusive, it's measurable, it's defined. Most of us don't know what our mission is because we never thought about it. No one ever told us to think about it. And even if you do, you don't know the answer. What is my mission in life? In the Hebrew vernacular, the word for shliach, shlichus, you hear about shluchim, shluchos, means mission. That's what it means. Now there's always the idea of a mission. From the beginning of time, Adam and Eve in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, were sent on a mission. But the Rebbe realized that we're living in a time that either you're going to live a survival-centric life or a mission-centric life. Either you're going to be responding and being reactive, or you're going to initiate, which brings me to the I of my part, the I, to initiate. Talk about that in a moment more. So mission, that you were sent to this world, you, every one of you here, everyone on earth, 8 billion people, with a mission that's exclusive to you, that you and only you can accomplish. Do you know how empowering that is? Most of us, if you think about it, 8 billion people, I'm another grain of sand on a big beach. Who really cares what I do? Now let's be honest, how committed can you be to something that if you think you're arbitrary or you're unnecessary or negligible? Yeah, we're valuable to our family, to our community, to people that know us, but on a cosmic level, do I really matter? And that's what the Rebbe came to emphasize. Was this concept known before? Yes, it was known before, but a leader is not about necessarily coming up with an original idea. You know, that professor who spent half his life writing his paper, and then he showed it to the wizards of the world, and he showed it to them, they came back with their mark. Your paper is both good and original. And he was very unbelievably flattered. They said, one problem, the part that's good is not original, and the part that's original is not good. You know? So original doesn't always mean that it has to be something no one ever said. It means you know when to say it in the right time, and a stage in life and in history, we're seeing that apathy and comfort zones and leisure and free time would dominate. The Rebbe came with a counterforce, not to fight apathy, but to introduce the idea that you need to feel a sense of urgency because you're here on a mission. When an astronaut is sent to space, every move counts. It's not like he could say, you know what, I'm taking vacation for a week. No, it's life and death. You're on a mission. And that's what the Rebbe infused in people, understanding a mission. I remember it was 2 days after Gimel Tammuz, 29 years ago. I was interviewed. I don't know if we can mention his name, but I'll mention it. Charlie Rose. And I remember him asking me, I was there with Ari Goldman, who was then the religion correspondent for the New York Times. And Rose, he was a very good interviewer. Did a lot of homework. He prepared himself. He said to me, you sat at the Rebbe's feet. Tell me, what was it like? And this was live. I had to come up with it. I wasn't prepared for this question. So I said what it was like. It was like you felt that you have a job to do, that if you don't do it, no one else is going to do it. You felt tremendously empowered and responsible. And I remember him visibly being moved, and he said, wow, I wish I had a mentor like that. So many people will say the Rebbe's charisma, his blue eyes, piercing eyes, how great he was, how brilliant, all that's true. But above all was giving the greatest gift of all, a mission. Which leads to the next point, that a mission also implies that you are responsible for fulfilling that mission. No matter what a teacher gives you, whatever your mentor, whatever your teacher, parents, it ultimately has to become something you own and that you initiate. It was a fundamental principle from day one where the Rebbe said, I'm not going to do the job for you. You have to do the job. It's always easier if someone else does the job for you. I will empower you. I will meet you halfway. But you have to initiate. You can educate people, inspire them, but true education is not the transference of knowledge, data, and information. It's the transfer of methodology. Teaching people not what to think, but how to think. Not just giving people answers to questions, but how to answer a question. You want the secret of Chabad? Is because Chabad is not a company and the Rebbe is not a CEO. It's a spiritual movement that empowered individuals, that every shliach and shluch, every man and woman on this earth that was touched by the Rebbe, and even those that didn't see the Rebbe, were empowered to be leaders. And that's why not one Chabad leader has quit his job, even after the Rebbe's passing. Because it was not about the Rebbe, it was about the cause. And it was empowering people that wherever you are, you own it. And there's not one Chabad person on earth that will ever give that up, because that's something that becomes part of who you are. To initiate. The third thing is persistence. I remember I was a little child. I was 9 years old in Crown Heights. It was Sukkot. So we sit in the sukkah. The Rebbe had a custom that he would have a farbrengen, a gathering in the sukkah, which was right next to 770. If you're ever there, there's a courtyard to the right of 770. A sukkah was built, and the Rebbe would bring twice throughout sukkahs in the sukkah. Maybe more than twice, but in those days it was twice. That sukkahs was 1966, Tafshin Chav Zayin. It didn't stop raining from beginning to end of sukkahs. Now, in a Chabad sukkah, they put on very heavy schach, the heavy evergreens on top of the roof. So in the beginning of a drizzle, it's fine. But once it gets saturated, forget about it. Then it's like very miserable because it comes down in globs. I'm going to go into graphic detail, but it's not pleasant. And here the Rebbe is sitting there in the sukkah, bringing oblivious, speaking the deepest ideas. Of course, Chassidim are all gathered around, only because the Rebbe is there, of course, not because they like rain. And interestingly, just for the record, the Rebbe, it was not lost on anyone, the humor. The Rebbe said a discourse called V'shavtem mayim b'sasin, which means to draw water with joy. It is a theme of sukkahs, but it was also raining, so... Anyway, I, as a child, I couldn't hear the Rebbe speaking because I was from a distance. I'm watching this sight, impressionable little kid. And I'm looking, but something remained with me till this day. I don't know if I thought it through then because I was too young, but in retrospect, there's a thing called in the United States called a rain date, right? When it's raining, you reschedule. There's also a thing called, the Rebbe could have easily had a farbrengen inside the building. So you don't drink, you don't eat. The farbrengen was not about the drinking and the eating, it was the Rebbe's Torah. So why did he insist on having to sit in a sukkah in such uncomfortable circumstances? But the effect it had on me was because, you know why? Because you do something good, nothing stops you from doing something good. Persistence, like drops, like relentless waves that never go to sleep. That's what remained with me. It affects me till this day. There are many things that you do. One day you're under the weather, one day you're over the weather, you're not in the mood. What I learned from that was you start something good, never stop. I give a class Wednesday night. Every Wednesday night, started in 1981. It's 42 years now. I've never stopped a class once. Today I do it online. And there are many excuses I could have had. But this is what remained with me. Persistence. Something good is eternal. You keep doing it. Maybe you'll see fruits of your labor immediately, maybe you won't, but you never stop. There are plenty of things we should stop, but not the good things that you do. That type of persistence. And it has tremendous impact. I remember 9/11 was Tuesday. I was in New York, and Wednesday class. The problem was all the bridges were closed. So how do I get from Brooklyn to Manhattan? My class was in Manhattan. And I was not going to swim across the East River. Not that, I wasn't that persistent. But I figured it out. All the roads were closed, were anyway empty. So I found a road through the Midtown Tunnel. I went through Queens. Actually, I got there faster than ever because there was no traffic altogether. I arrived the Upper West Side where my class was. 250 people, 300 people. Usually it would be 70, 80 people. Because everybody was a certain communal vulnerability that we all needed each other. Persistence. The fourth thing is opportunities. So here's how a leader, a Rebbe, thinks. And a lesson for all of us, especially in our time. Another story. My father was a journalist, I mentioned. He had a mini stroke in 1989. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, he was in the hospital, NYU. That year, the Rebbe had a farbrengen, actually the first day Rosh Hashanah. Rabbi Groner, the Rebbe's secretary, told me later that he thinks it was in my father's honor. The Rebbe had signaled to me to say l'chaim for my father's health. Anyway, Erev Yom Kippur, the day before Yom Kippur, I'm summoned. The Rebbe wants to see me. So I go downstairs, called the Gan Eden Atacht, in the room next to the Rebbe's personal office. I'm standing there, the Rebbe comes out with 2 pieces of honey cake. It's called lekach. On Erev Yom Kippur, we give the custom to give honey cake. And the Rebbe says in Yiddish, give this to your father, and he should have a healthy and sweet year. Then the Rebbe smiles and tells me, tell your father, I'll say it in Yiddish in case anyone speaks Yiddish here. Anyway, I like to say it in Yiddish anyway. The Rebbe says in Yiddish, he says, Zog dem Taten, aber Schas hat verrendigen sein Schliches, war was mit dem Geschick dort, wird man von dort nach Reis losen. Tell your father that when he finishes the mission for which he was sent, where he is now, which was the hospital, he will be released. So I make my way immediately to NYU. It was the day before Yom Kippur. I had to get there quickly. I bring the cake. I give it to my father. I tell my father the message. Now, between us, nobody goes to hospitals for a mission. You go to a hospital because you've got no choice. Because you're in danger or you're in trouble and you need care. But the Rebbe didn't see that way. Even adversity, even a challenge is an opportunity. It means for some reason God wanted my father there to accomplish something. He would never been able to get him there unless it went through this unfortunate incident. Imagine looking at life that way. Of course, we don't ask for any negative things to happen in life, but if something does happen, it's not the end of the story. There's always deeper opportunity. It's a major lesson the Rebbe taught. In our day and age, in all the healing and recovery I mentioned before, everyone's looking for the formula. How do you get through difficulties in life? Suffering, dysfunctionality, abuse, trauma. And the answer, as I said at the outset, is because you have a soul inside of you that's more powerful than the trauma. And you are not defined by what happens to you. It happened to you. What you're defined by is God's plan for you in this world. You can't control the circumstances, but you can control how you navigate. And navigating means that everything is an opportunity. And finally, destination. So I use the word destination very deliberately because language is very important. I'll just share a story. I don't know what's our story with time here. We're doing all right? Yeah? Okay. I have your attention? Okay. The rule is a speaker should never say I'm about to end, so I'm not going to say that, but you get the hint. So, I remember in the early years when I was giving my class, most of the people that were coming for whatever reason were from the arts and entertainment industry. These were most Jews, some non-Jews, people in the music industry, in Hollywood, writers and so on. And they were all very spiritual, but not in any way traditional. Many of them would say their spirituality came from Zen Buddhism and a thing that's not an acronym for Let's Start Davening. LSD. Let's save some time so you don't have to figure it out. Okay. And I realized that I was sitting there at a disadvantage because here I am, I'm not projecting a neutral image, a beard in the yarmulke. Yeah, back to the beard in the yarmulke. You see, I'm very self-conscious, right? So, and here I am teaching, and I don't know whether they're stereotyping me or not. You know, I may remind one person of an angry grandfather that schlepped him to synagogue in Yom Kippur, or irrelevant Hebrew school teacher that taught him or her hollow bar mitzvah lessons or bat mitzvah lessons. Or maybe even war memories of a parent or grandparent that sat at a Pesach Seder. Who knows? So I tried an experiment. I said to myself, I'm not going to use any Torah, religious, Jewish words. No, I'm Jewish enough. I don't need to use the words. Okay? I'm going to create my own language. So instead of the word God, I used words like essence, the essence. Which actually, if you look at it, atzmos and mohos means the essence. Doesn't necessarily. Instead of the word God, the higher reality. If it was a particularly New Age group, I use words like indeterministic layers of undefined energy, you know. And instead of Torah, I use the word blueprint. Instead of mitzvahs, connections. Instead of Geula Mashiach, I use the word destination. And there I was pontificating and waxing eloquent about reaching the essence and the higher reality, and following a blueprint, making the connections until we reach a total fusion, seamless flow between the indeterministic and the deterministic, between form and function, between body and soul, between the inner and the outer, in one transparent harmony within diversity. Heaven and earth joining together in one union. And I was going on like this week after week. They were loving it. I was enjoying myself. After a few weeks, remember one of the people in the class, his name was Kenny Vance. He was, you're probably all too young to remember Jay and the Americans in the 60s. So he was a singer in that group. And he comes over to me before one of the classes and says, tell me, are you talking about God? Because everyone loves it, but they don't know whether. So I said, yeah, but don't spoil it for the others. And that was that. So that's a lesson in life, that sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it. The same idea can be said with different words, because you never know. Words are loaded. I may say a word that to me is very simple and innocent, but it may trigger in you, who knows what, a word that your mother went ballistic every time she heard that word. So destination, my friends, is the central theme that the Rebbe established, just like we began with mission. If you have a mission implies that the mission will be realized and fulfilled. So destination is the word that I'm using here for Geula and Mashiach. That when you look in the Rebbe's talk, starting from the beginning, 1951, when he first assumed leadership officially, and throughout the years, was all about fulfilling a mission of joining heaven and earth, yes, fusing indeterministic and deterministic matter and energy, and that Mashiach and Geula will be that destination that we have all been waiting for, that our parents and grandparents and the millions and billions of good deeds and mitzvahs that we've done are like building blocks that accumulate together and create what we call Geula. Because in Judaism, redemption is not just an event, it's a process. It's a process that began from the beginning of time, and every moment we get closer to it. And the Rebbe made it very clear that after thousands of years of the hard work and the sacrifices and the pains, that we're ready to enter that stage. And what's that stage? It's not something that is crazy. It's what everybody aspires for. World peace, the obliteration of famine, of pain, of suffering. The words of the Rambam, Maimonides. Said in those words, Mashiach and Geula, I find it to be the least controversial topic, frankly, to talk about. It's far harder to explain to people why you turn a chicken over your head 3 times before Yom Kippur than to explain the concept of Mashiach. The only reason I think it's controversial is because people misunderstand what it is, and it's been tainted and been hijacked, frankly. I'm not going to get into all the hijackers. And it's misunderstood what it is. And this was the driving message that all of us right here are partners and shluchim, everyone, not just the official card-carrying messenger, but each one of us is an ambassador of God in this world to refine our little corner of the world, to spiritualize the material, to bridge faith and modernity, to bridge and find the divine union. And if it's 446 bridges, so be it, probably a lot more than that. Each in our own way, to discover and actualize our mission, take initiative, persistence. Everything is an opportunity and everything is leading somewhere toward a destination. My father often would tell me, he said there are three types of people. People who make things happen, people who watch things happen, and people who ask what happened. So, I'm here to say to you, I was honored, and we're all honored, to have been in the presence and continue to be in the presence of a man of God, a selfless man that was not dedicated to anything about himself. The cause was more important than everything, and the cause is eternal. And when you connect yourself to something eternal, it lives on forever. That's the secret of Chabad. It's nothing to do, it's not a cult personality, it's not about an individual, how great anyone is. It's a cause, a divine, eternal, immortal cause. And each of us have the opportunity to choose that. You either choose temporary things in your life, impermanent things. So as great as you are, everything in this material world deteriorates, erodes, and perishes. The only thing that does not are the eternal values, the eternal divine within each of us in our souls, the eternal divine spark in each part of existence, and God Himself that works through each one of us. So when we connect to our divine image and understand its mission, why it was sent to this world, to spiritualize your corner of the world, yes, all of us become an extension of that eternity. And that's why we say Am Yisrael Chai, not because we're so great, but because we connect to greatness and we become an extension of greatness. And ultimately, imagine our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. Some of them are here on earth, but many are not. They are watching from wherever they are this long marathon of history, who now the baton has been passed on to us. And we were blessed with a man like the Rebbe, who dedicated himself to teach us our mission and did everything possible in every possible way. So I would encourage everyone here, generally, but especially now in honor of the 29th anniversary that's coming this Thursday, and this evening is honoring that. Study. Commit yourself to studying something from the Rebbe's teachings. Go a step further. Every one of us have our questions, we have our dilemmas, we have our quandaries, our struggles. Bring your questions to someone that can show you what the Rebbe would say. You'd be shocked and surprised how relevant these messages are. And you may find answers that you never found until now. And I don't say that, I'm not exaggerating this. Try it out. I wrote Toward a Meaningful Life for that reason. Obviously it's not a book that covers everything, but it covers a lot. But there are many more teachings of the Rebbe. So bring any question you have, anything you're struggling with, whether it's in your marriage, or it's with children, or it's in your personal life, psychological life, emotional life, or it's at work, or bigger decisions you have to make. Yeah, knock down the doors of your rabbis that know the Rebbe's teachings and insist, what would the Rebbe say about this? And remember, the Rebbe comes on the shoulders of the Rebbes that came before him, the Alter Rebbe, and all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. So we're not just talking about one man here, we're talking about a formidable power that goes back from the beginning of time. May we merit to be able to access these teachings and these inspirations and experience it in a way that empowers us to live up and actualize our greatest potential, affect your sphere of influence, things that you do on a daily basis, and may we all merit to finally finish that job and reach the destination when we tip the scale and bring personal and global redemption. Thank you so much.
There are two. Thank you very much, Rabbi Davidson, for that beautiful talk. There are two things that the Rebbe was very particular about. Number one, the Rebbe loved getting reports of events, but always wanted to know one word, Habepoel Mamish. What's the reality? What came out in action as a result? We are launching here, and everyone can join everyone except them by themselves, one mitzvah. In order, before the end of the year, we're getting towards the end of the year, Rosh Hashanah, you get the community together, try your friends at least have one mitzvah that we add, to get onto that QR code and join putting your mitzvah on there. Second, never took excuses, as Rabbi Jacobson said so eloquently. We found that UPS box in the North Shore, and there's books outside. I'm not kidding. I want to thank Nachman. I don't know if he's in the crowd for finding and hunting that black box down. There's a case of. We have a box for towards a meaning for life. It's the book.